Hi, Peter Salemi. Deuteronomy, the 34th chapter, has led many people to believe that Moses was not the author of the books of the law. And they have created many theories, like the documentary hypothesis that was put together in the 1800s by German scholars like Julius Wellhausen, who've put together this theory called the documentary hypothesis to try and figure out who really authored the books of the law. Now, that theory has been thoroughly disproven, and I urge you to read this book by Josh McDowell, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, Volume 2, and he goes into great detail about the documentary hypothesis and, of course, disproves it thoroughly. In this book, The Old Testament Documents by Walter Kaiser, Are They Reliable? On page 17, he writes this about this documentary hypothesis. He says it is now diminishing in prestige, G, E, D, and P. These are the alleged sources for the entire Pentateuch. And he says no one has ever seen such G, E, D, or P documents or any allusions to them in any ancient literature paralleling the tenfold references to the accounts or generations of that we read in the book of Genesis. Thus, such hypothetical documents may be safely discounted in favor of real sources that are consistently referred to in the text or are identified from epigraphic materials discovered in the ancient Near East. So this documentary hypothesis just holds no water. It's been thoroughly disproven. And again, I urge you to read this book by Josh McDowell that thoroughly disproves it. But where does this idea come from that Moses was not the author of the books of the law? Well, it comes from Deuteronomy, the 34th chapter, verse 5. It says this: So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died. And people say, well, how can Moses write about his own death? And so then begins the speculation that, well, then all the books of the Old Testament here, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, all these books therefore weren't authored by Moses. The speculation just starts running wild, and then all these weirdo theories start to come to light. And it's just, the solution is just so simple. It is obvious that Joshua was the one who completed Deuteronomy, the 34th chapter. Many people say that Deuteronomy 34 is actually the first chapter of the book of Joshua. Notice what it says here. In Deuteronomy 34:9, it says, Joshua, the son of Nun, was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands upon him, and the children of Israel hearkened unto him, and did as the Lord commanded Moses. Joshua was filled with the spirit of wisdom that he gave to Moses. He also gave to Joshua, and it says here in Joshua 24:26, it says, And Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law. So here we see Joshua writing in the book of the law. Joshua was the one that wrote Deuteronomy, the 34th chapter. And this is nothing new. Even in today's world, many authors have died, like J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote the Lord of the Rings, and others. Before completing their work, other authors have picked up their work, edited it, and of course completed their works. And of course the Bible is no different. Let me just read to you again from this book by Kaiser. He says here on page 22, he says, So what is the answer to these and other post-Mosaica materials? It says, It was Joshua who added these words to the first 5 books of the law under the direction and inspiration of the Holy Spirit. For that is what Joshua 24:26 describes him as doing, as I just read to you. In other words, in the Torah, it says here that Joshua recorded all these words in the book of the law, in other words, in the Torah. It would appear that Joshua was responsible for some, if not all, of the post-Mosaica under the same divine utterance as Moses, as I read to you here in Deuteronomy 34:9, who gave the original and the greater part of the rest of the collection of the Torah. The fact that Moses had laid the book of the law before God in the tabernacle surely indicates that it had come to some form of completion in most of its present form, what we read today. Therefore, statements about its needing to be completed as late as the Babylonian exile, as some source critical theories presume, are surely wide of the mark. So it just doesn't hold any water. Joshua was the one that, of course, penned the book, the 34th chapter of the book of Deuteronomy. And as I said, other authors that died and didn't complete their works, other authors have picked up their works and edited it and completed it. And here in this book, when critics asked by Howe, page 132, he writes the same thing here. It's entirely reasonable to assume that someone, perhaps Joshua, added the final chapter to the book of Moses as a fitting conclusion to the life of this great man, talking about Moses. It is not at all an uncommon practice for someone to add an obituary to the end of a work by a great man. This would be similar to the practice of one author writing a preface to the work of another author. So it's obvious. Joshua was the one who wrote this last chapter in the book of Deuteronomy, and the scriptures are clear that Moses was the one that wrote the bulk of the Torah. We have Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy written by Moses, as it clearly says in many scriptures. Deuteronomy 4 and 5, 1 Kings 2, verse 3, 8 and 9, 2 Kings 14. The Gospels, Jesus Christ himself said that Moses was the author of the Torah. The Apostle Paul in Romans the 10th chapter, verse 19, and other places of the Bible clearly show that Moses was the author of the Torah. And Joshua was the one, as it says here by this author, was a likely candidate for the authorship of Deuteronomy 34. Most commentators and Jewish tradition agree. So Moses wrote Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. When it comes to the book of Genesis, Moses was the editor. Moses was the one that took all the clay tablets of Adam, Seth, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. They wrote on clay tablets, and we see this in Genesis, the 5th chapter. And I wrote an article on this, and I'll put the link in the description below, and you can read it, who wrote the book of Genesis. And we see here in Genesis, the 5th chapter, verse 1, it says this: "This is the book of the generations of Adam." Adam wrote this book. This was his clay tablet. And then we see other places in Genesis. We see in other places of Genesis, this is the book of, and then we know that that is their clay tablet. So Adam wrote a clay tablet. Noah wrote. Seth, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph wrote these clay tablets. Moses, he took these clay tablets, put it together, edited some parts, put it together, and of course created the book of Genesis. And then in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the bulk of that was written by Moses. And it's so obvious all over the books of the Bible. It's obvious that Moses wrote it. And in Deuteronomy 34, Joshua comes in and pretty much wrote about the death of Moses, an obituary, the death of Moses. And then it says here that in verse 10, that there arose not a prophet since in Israel like unto Moses, whom God knew face to face. There were other prophets during that time, like Miriam, she was called a prophetess. Aaron was sent as well. We read of the company of the prophets and so on. The 70 elders of Israel. They were servants of the Lord, but none of them compared to Moses, who did signs and wonders, verse 11, which the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt to Pharaoh and to all his servants and to all his land. And so there are other prophets, but none of them compared to Moses. This is what Joshua wrote about the great man, Moses, who wrote the bulk of the book of the law. So to say that Moses was not the author of the bulk of the books of the law is a very large biblical misconception.